Hello, everyone, and good evening. My name is Heather Boykman, and I'm an AmeriCorps member that is serving with Chagrin River Watershed Partners. As a reminder, we will be having a Q&A at the end of the presentation, and there is a question area that you can put your questions in while the presentation is going. This webinar is being recorded, and you can re-watch it at Chagrin River Watershed Partners YouTube channel, and also check out past virtual events of the speaker series there as well. And tonight we are joined by Adam Rugela. Did I pronounce it right, Adam?
Yes.
Okay. Adam is a PhD student in the geography department of Kent State, and is kind of actually, I graduated from Kent State, and I was the environmental studies program, so I'm very familiar of that area. He's currently researching exploring environmental history of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park and ways in which history is or is not represented. Prior to coming to Kent, Adam studied oak silviculture at Western Virginia University, and also, and I know you've also worked with ODNR. All right, Adam, I'm just going to let you take it over before I just keep on talking.
Okay, I think you can see.
I can see your PowerPoint. There you go. Perfect.
Okay, that's great. All right. Yes, thank you very much, Heather. So yeah, my name's Adam Rugela. I'm a PhD student here at Kent State University, or there. I guess no one is at Kent State right now. So, but yeah, so a little bit about my history. I guess Heather did a good job, but I was at the University of Wyoming. I got a master's degree in geography. I was looking at sort of human environment interaction, specifically sort of people on the Appalachian Trail was my study of research, and how they sort of, the Appalachian Trail was represented, and sort of that representation internalized by people hiking it. So sort of the culture of through hikers on the Appalachian Trail. And then I was like, well, that's neat, but I spent a lot of time in the woods, and I wanted to spend a lot of time in the woods, and I started looking for jobs, and I kept on looking at these forestry jobs. And then I realized I needed a forestry degree. So I went to West Virginia University, and I studied specifically oak silviculture. So I'm sure, as many of you know, we have issues in the eastern United States. We have a lot of big oaks in the overstory, and we don't have a lot of little oaks in the understory, which means that we have a sort of problem on the horizon in regenerating and repopulating those very important oaks in our future forests. So I studied that, and then went and worked for a while as just a sort of land management forester in the Adirondack region of New York for a private industry. And then I got a job for the Division of Forestry in Southern Ohio, doing the same thing, which is managing sort of state-owned forests, large tracts of land. So a lot of people are familiar with Hawking State Forest. I spent more time in Pike and Brush Creek and Shawnee State Forest mostly, but the same principle. And then I did that for a while, found myself up in Northeast Ohio because I'm originally from sort of, from Bolivar, which is just in between New Philadelphia and Canton. And yeah, after working for a while up here, the pandemic hit, and I was just rethinking things, and I always wanted to go back to school. So I go back to geography, and now I'm still interested in forests because I really believe forests are sort of at this nexus of the natural environment, as well as the values and both economics or spiritual, cultural, that we place on forests and forest landscapes. And so they all converge in sort of this living, breathing ecosystem that both ties us back to our past, but we are sort of managing, looking to the future. And so most of my research has been in Appalachia, and it still is today, looking at the Smokies. So for this, I'm looking forward to the question session, because there are probably a lot of people that have a lot more intimate knowledge of the settlement history and the land use history of sort of Geauga and Lake County and Northeast Ohio than I specifically do. So, but I'll try to do a broad overview and what I gleaned from some of the literature and stuff like that. So yeah, I'll just get started. All right, so let me figure out. Okay, sorry, I was trying to get something out of the way there. All right, so just a sort of introduction to the approach that I'm taking with this, right? This is an environmental history approach, so I'm really looking at this as the forest as this unique entity. Traditional history oftentimes kind of ignores the environment, right? The environment just is a background to, if you had history classes like me, kind of old school traditional history classes, they were, you know, story of kings, presidents, important people, throw a few battles in there, maybe a piece of legislation, and all this happens in some place, in some environment, and every once in a while it pops up as relevant. But most of the time, it's just there in the background. It's the setting, right? Doesn't really focus the environment, doesn't really sort of investigate or critique the relationship between the human society and their environment. I could have also approached this from the perspective that I would have if I was maybe a more forester, right? I say, all right, the forest, it is a object, it is something there that, you know, that I can tell the history of the forest as a place and an entity that me as a forester am using my scientific knowledge to practice management activities to the outcomes that I desire, right? This idea that the forest is something that can be, with my scientific knowledge, manipulated to my ends, right? With this environmental history approach, I really focus, and I want to focus, we'll see how I do it in this specific talk, but on the way that we are shaped by our environment. You know, the settlers, the history of settlement and development of Northeast Ohio is shaped by that forested landscape that they encountered, right? But that forest has been and continues to be shaped by the people as well. And so what you have is more of an iterative process, right? And so for me, the forest really sits at the center of, or that nexus of, you know, the physical geography. I'm talking about sort of, you know, the climate, the geology, the topography of the region, right? The past land uses, right? And then also our present land uses and decisions. And if you'll see on this, you know, there's a reason these arrows are going both ways, because of course we know that physical geography, the climate dictates the forest that we develop, but we also know that forests are, as forests and ecosystems are active agents in weathering and shaping that topography, right? And yes, past land uses, they impact the forest, but obviously those early settlers, indigenous populations, had to be responsive to that forest environment. And all of these different past land uses, as well as that physical geography, are creating these forests, converging on this forest that we today have to negotiate when we try to think of, all right, what is the landscape we've inherited? What are the limitations of that landscape, and what are the opportunities of that landscape, right? All right, so if we're going to start out, well, first thing we need to know if we're going to talk about forests in Northeast Ohio are, or at least the first thing I want to know as a forester is, well, what's the forest type, right? Well, actually, the forests in Northeast Ohio are kind of in a funny transition zone where it took a while for people to decide what they really wanted to call it and where it fits in, right? If we wanted to be broad and vague, we can call it Eastern deciduous, but that pretty much takes up everything in the Eastern United States that exists between sort of the northern pine, hemlock, spruce forest and the southern pine forest, right? So that's not particularly instructive. A lot of times, and you'll hear it called the beech maple birch forest. In case most of you probably, if you go around and spend a lot of time in the forests of Northeast Ohio. You know, yeah, there's a lot of maple. Yeah, depending on where you are, there's a lot of beech. I don't usually see a lot of birch, right? But you know, that's what's used in this map, and that's often what's referred to. Vaguely and generally, you also hear the term northern hardwood. Of course, northern hardwood is problematic because, you know, here in Northeast Ohio, we're kind of in a little bit of appendage of that northern hardwood forest type that actually extends through Pennsylvania all the way up into New York, places where I like to work in the past, and into New England. So as someone that worked in the Adirondacks, that was in sort of the northern hardwood proper, you might say, I always have a little bit of problem looking at the forests that we have here and calling them northern hardwood, even though there's a lot of overlap with species. Sometimes you get around that by calling it Allegheny hardwood. That kind of ties it in with the forest that we have in Pennsylvania and the Allegheny Plateau there. And there's a good match, a lot more representation of cherry in those forests. Another term that gets applied is mixed mesophytic hardwood. And that's actually one I like the most, mostly because they use the term mixed, which is kind of generic, but it's actually a good catch-all, because what it means is a lot of times these forest types are tried to sort of identified by the, as you'll see with maple, beech, birch, top 2 or top 3 species that are common. Mixed mesophytic recognizes that this is a forest type that, depending on where you are in the region, right, it might have a very different composition of tree species, and none of them might be particularly more dominant or less dominant than the others. Although the important part is that mesophytic section, and hardwood too, which is a deciduous forest, and we know we're mostly doing with that, with the exception of sort of some ravines and things with hemlocks. But that mesophysic means it's a fairly moist, damp forest, right? And that's really important, because what that's going to do is that distinguishes it from the forest of southern Ohio. As you can see right here in this bright green, this is where I've actually done most of my work historically when in the state of Ohio. And that's going to be our oak hickory group, right? These are what we call more xeric. They're dry species, a lot of oak dominated species. You'll sometimes get into forests that are, you know, nothing but 80% oak or something like that. So we really sit in sort of this transition. You know, in Northeast Ohio, we're on the edge of that northern hardwood beech, maple, birch forest, but also we're at the edge of that oak hickory group forest. So it's a lot of interesting things happening. All right, so I gave you a bunch of sort of possible terms to use for it. As I said, depending on where I'm at, I don't know if I ever like any of them. So sometimes it's just easier to go to the numbers, right? Now this is from Ohio's Forests, 2016. It's an ODNR report. Take for as a grain of salt, because this basically covers a much larger region of what qualifies as Northeast Ohio than sort of the specific area that we're talking about today, looking at sort of the Chagrin watershed, or the Western Reserve lands, and I'll mostly be talking about them. But you know, you see, you know, a lot of maple. You know, if you look over here, you know, percentage of total regional volume, right? So this is a good indicator of the importance. You know, red maple represents 20% of the volume in the forests of northeastern Ohio. Sugar maple, another 10, almost 10%. Same with black cherry. Northern red oak is another important component, and pen oak, which is a type of red oak, but a different species. And then you get quite a few splattering of, you know, yellow poplar, all these common trees. I'm sure we've seen a lot. White ash, I haven't seen one with leaves in a long time, which is unfortunate. So as you see here, the percent change in volume, it's, you know, dropping dramatically. And then your hickories, right? You know, despite the fact that it's a maple beech forest, you know, at least in Northeast Ohio in general, you know, that beech isn't a huge component, though it is certainly present. I know that can change very specifically with spite, with any given site, especially as we move up to where you guys are in like Lake County and that Lake Plains area, right? So that gives you a little sense when we say this mesophytic or northern hardwood, what we're talking about. Again, like I said, doesn't really fit that beech birch, at least the birch part of it, right? But, you know, that impulse to just sort of group and categorize things and divide them up, that's sort of this inherent human instinct. And sometimes it's better to just, take a look at it because you know it when you see it. And so these are probably forests that you're familiar with, right? Here's a really classic example of that. I think we have some basswood there. It looks like some yellow poplar maybe as well. But what I'm also seeing here is a really thick mid-story. And if you look here, we have these maple trees, these young maple trees. They're shade-tolerant species. So these are all the things that make it, you can imagine going in there. That's the type of forest I think of as a northern hardwood, maple beech forest or mixed mesophytic forest. It's a forest where it's shady, it's a dense shade, it's cool. You can see high humidity and moisture there, right? And of course, this is holding arboretum, right? One of the classic things about this type of forest is these really vibrant colors that we have in the fall with the maples, right? So that's all nice. Well, we just spent a lot of time when we decided that we know maybe what type of forest we're talking about, which all of you probably knew to begin with, right? The question is, why or how do we end up with these forests here, at least in the composition that they are and where they are in the landscape, the distribution that they have here. And then that begs the question of sort of what does the future look like and what are the implications for the future once we know a little bit about that history. So let's jump into it. First things first, right? I mentioned that physical geography is an important contribution to the forest type or the forest that we have here in Northeast Ohio. And, might as well start at the very foundation, and the very foundation is Earth itself, right? And if I were trying to pick one feature to sort of explain the vegetative distribution, the forest types, and the land use types in the state of Ohio, I would pick the extent of the glaciation, right? If you follow this line right here, this is the extent of the Wisconsin glaciation. It cut right across diagonally the state of Ohio right there. Everything north of that was basically ground under miles and miles of ice, right? And as that miles and miles of ice ground over it, right, it brought with it all that sediment, all that gravel from the places it had moved over before. And eventually it settled down. And then thankfully, for those of us living here, it began to slowly retreat, right? And so in that process, in this area of Northeast Ohio right here, where we're still on what we would call the Allegheny Plateau, it ground down all those Allegheny mountains. It ground down all that topography. It smoothed it out, right? Smooths it out. But at the same time, all that gravel, those rocks, those finer sediment deposits that had picked up and frozen with it and carried with it, as it receded, it left it behind, right? And so it left this, what we call a glacial till, which created these really deep soils. It also left a bunch of different features that basically amount to different shapes and directions of various depressions and hills, really small hills, right? So in contrast to the hills that we get in Southern Ohio that are very sort of driven by the hydrology, when you get into Northeast Ohio, these glaciated places, a lot of times that hydrology was driven by the variations in deposition and excavation of the glaciation process, right? And a classic example of that is if we look right here, the Cuyahoga River. The way the Cuyahoga River starts to go south, it looks like for all intents and purposes, that river should join up with the Tuscarawas River here and just flow all the way down to the Muskingum and Ohio River, right? But all of a sudden, it gets redirected and takes this bizarre turn north into Lake Erie. Likewise, the Grand River, right? It goes up north, it makes sense. Why doesn't it just keep going flowing north? And then it takes that abrupt turn west, right? These are kind of features that we can associate with these disruptive sort of topography in really extreme local variation that we can get, right? And so good examples are here. This is just something I use from my physical geography class. This is an example of the eskers, are these long ridges that kind of go, in our case, north-south with the sort of retreat of the glacier. You have a lot of these moraines. A lot of times these elevated little things, these are sort of kettles, are these little kettle lakes here. So just little small lakes and depressions that later get filled in. A lot of these elevations, they're going to be really kind of gravelly or sandy material, so they're going to be excessively well drained, while the landscapes around it, the depressions, are going to be very poorly drained, right? And that's something that I think most of the people that have spent a lot of time in a lot of different places in Northeast Ohio can appreciate, right? You have these areas and you'll be walking around and you'll have suddenly, it'll seem like you have a foot or two difference, and you'll have one area that's just really boggy and wet. In another area, it's going to be nice and dry and bone dry, right? That's kind of characteristic of these older glaciated landscapes, right? I was just the other day in Kent Bogs. That's a perfect example. Kent Bogs, you're going through. It was a kettle lake, so it was a lake that eventually, over the thousands of years since, slowly filled in with vegetation and peat to create this sort of relic of the, what today we would think of as a landscape we expect to see in Ontario or Canada, right? But as you're walking into it, there's just a little mound of this more sandy, silty till material, and you see white oaks or otherwise trees that you would expect to see in this area, as well as in sort of drier states right next to it on the other side, right? So a lot of kind of weird local variations, right? And the other thing, right? So we have the foundation. As far as physical geography goes, we know that the landscape, the topography, the soils are all sort of heavily influenced by that glaciation, right? But we can't talk about forest without talking about climate, right? And this shows, I don't know how many of you are familiar with, but this sort of Köppen climate system, right? But there are variations on how sort of specific sub classifications go. If you look at a big map of the United States, you say Ohio is probably all kind of this sort of humid continental climate, right? Nice 4 seasons, it's all the same. If you look at a smaller scale, look at some of these sub-classifications, you see maybe why Northeast Ohio has this different forest type, right? It's called warm summer humid continental. So humid, lots of rain, continental, it's telling us as a temperate climate, it's going to get all 4 season types, right? It's not influenced excessively by ocean currents, right? And then it's warm summer, right? So that's telling us that it is a cooler, moister climate than the rest of the state of Ohio, right? That might explain for us why we're having in this little corner of Ohio a forest type that much more approximates forest types that I saw in places in eastern New York and the Adirondacks, or parts of other parts of New York and Pennsylvania, than we see just a few, a couple dozen miles south of us, right? And of course, speaking of precipitation, people in Northeast Ohio either love the fact that they get a lot more snow, or they love to complain about the fact that they get a lot more snow than the rest of the state. Either way, I think this is just a really kind of glaring evidence of we're dealing with a different climate in that northeastern part of the state that drives sort of the vegetation and the forest dynamics there. All right, that's good. But we could talk about forest and physical geography all the time, but I'm really interested in the sort of land use type of it. And if we're going to talk about land use, we have to start talking at the very beginning, again, going back to the foundations, with indigenous land use. This is something of a problem in this region because there's a lot of uncertainty around the indigenous land use and the indigenous populations. I'm not an archaeologist. I'm not an expert on the indigenous populations of Ohio, certainly not Northeast Ohio. But what I've gleaned and my understanding is there's actually, not to say that there's not a lot to know, but there's not a lot that's certain or that's knowable for certain regarding the indigenous populations, pre-settlement populations, right? Obviously, there was the Erie tribe being a Iroquois language group, but not aligned with the Iroquois confederacy that we think of with the Seneca and stuff in central New York or western New York there. The reality is that the fact that Ohio was more central, that by the time settlers or any sort of Western Euro-American settlement or heavy interaction was reaching the region of Ohio, there was a fairly sparse population of indigenous people in Northeast Ohio as far as settlements go, long-term settlements. A lot of that can be contributed to the fact that even though that sort of movement of Western Euro-American settlement was relatively late, there was still contact with the French and influences from sort of the colonial powers in the eastern part of the continent that disrupted the populations and the social order. Specifically, it doesn't take a lot of contact for smallpox and other European diseases to reach a population and really decimate and wreak havoc with the demographics of a population, right? In addition, they were on sort of the margins, the western margins of those Iroquois tribes, and the beaver trade, specifically the fur trade, or the fur trade, specifically the beaver trade, had an influence in the sense that the Iroquois, as French, European, or just European traders in general, relatively, once they commodified the pelts, right, there was basically a extermination of beavers in the regions where in Western New York. And so the Iroquois nations, the Iroquois Confederacy, was sort of pressuring and expanding their territory and their hunting territory and trapping territory westward, and that sort of disbanded the Erie tribe. So long story short, we don't know a lot about the specific populations, demographics that would have been here pre-Euro-American arrival. What we do know is it would have been woodland Indian tribe. They would have practiced shifting slash and burg agriculture, right? Where they would have cleared an area by burning it out, farmed it for a while, a few years, probably about 3 years or so, 3 to 5 years. And then they would have relocated their, repeated the process again, right? This would have been done on a sort of, given a large landmass, a sustainable rotation, right? And even the more permanent settlements, because they would have been a sedentary agriculture society, at least partially so, they wouldn't have lasted much longer than 10 to 20 years before they would have relocated to another region or another area after sort of drawing down on the local resources. Supplementing that agriculture would have been fishing, hunting, and gathering practices, right? Which takes us to the way that they, other than the sedentary agriculture and the clearing of small fields for agriculture, manipulated that forest landscape, right? And one of the primary tools to do that would have been fire. These would have been what we think of as what I would call low intensity, in this region, more moderate frequency. They would have done it for a few reasons, right? They would have managed that forest vegetation, one, to sort of manipulate the structure. When I say structure, I'm talking about manipulating sort of, all right, there are a lot of big trees, is it really shrubby, right? That sort of vertical, large trees, mid-story, understory. By sort of burning out the mid-story and understory, you would have had a forest that was easier to move through. It would have been easier to hunt in that regard, right? It would also promoted new growth and forage for wildlife, game species like deer, right? So you have those two areas. So a lot of that was geared towards sort of manipulating the forest, both for vegetation types, but also for game species, specifically deer, right? As the scientist in me really wants to hesitate in saying anything too strongly about associations with oak, but studies have shown that two things. One, where we can or where they can find evidence through witness trees of sort of these more established indigenous woodland and Indian settlements, not necessarily always in Ohio, but in places like Western New York and some in Ohio as well. There tends to be a strong correlation with oak, right? Now we can think oaks provide acorns. Acorns are good for game species. Also, oak are a species that really responds well to fire. In fact, in other parts where I've worked, specifically Southern Ohio and West Virginia, there's a recognition that a lot of the oak trees, the oak dominated forests that we deal with in those regions, they are the product of indigenous burning. I alluded to the fact that we're dealing with this sort of challenge of how do we regenerate oak, because we have a lot of big oak and not a lot of small oak in the understory anymore. And there was a lot of head scratching and hand wringing about why that is, because, well, it's an oak forest. There are a bunch of oak trees. They're dropping acorns. It should be more oaks, right? Well, we realized that a lot of those forests were maintained by sort of this regular low intensity, so just understory fires at a relatively high frequency, right? And so that indigenous burning and then later your American burning really was what promoted and the oak forest that we have today, that we're now introducing other practices to try either through prescribed burning or sort of surrogates for fire to create that disturbance and regenerate oak. We still do have throughout this region here, hope you can see that arrow, associations with settlements with oak. There is also always the question of, well, is that because the Native Americans burned in that region, and in doing so prompted the regeneration of oak, or were these oak sites that were particularly useful to Native Americans, and so Native Americans settled in the oak sites? In all honesty, going to the point that that the humans in society sort of shape the environment and the environment shapes humans in society, it was probably a little bit of both, right? In the end, though, like I said, we can't be too certain about any of this, just because we really don't know what the population densities or settlement patterns were in the indigenous populations. Regarding forest, the effects of forest fires, you'll notice that, as I said, we're looking in Northeast Ohio here compared to the rest of Ohio, probably closer to, somewhere around 24 to 16 years between fire intervals, right? Between fire, it's still fairly frequent, right? But not anywhere near what we're getting in Southern Ohio, where we're talking about, one every 10 years or so, right? So it's hard to tell. Does that mean that they weren't using as much fire, that there were fewer Native Americans? It means they were using fire, but the fact that they're these sort of mesic moisture forest types with these lower depressions as fire breaks meant that rather than sort of starting a fire in a clearing, that it ran up a steep hill slope in a dry oak forest and just, ran off. Or maybe it just kind of, they were using fire as much, but the effects of it were much more localized because it didn't have the same landscape. It didn't have the same spread on the landscape. It's just really hard to know. What we do know is that, well, the narrative of indigenous burning that really fueled and created an oak forest in sort of the Southern Ohio and Appalachia doesn't apply as perfectly in Northeast Ohio. But I think it would also be fair to say that, regardless, Native Americans had a role in shaping those forests and probably had a strong influence in some of those shaping and maintaining those pockets of oak forest on highlands and small lower or on ridges and flats that we see today. So yeah. And then this, of course, with fire history, it's always really kind of difficult to actually recreate those or predict and nail down those intervals. So here's another example and another study that said, 7 to 12 years in the region, which just highlights that it's there's a lot of room for disagreement, right? All right, let's talk about early settlement now, right? Well, at the time of settlement, it's hard to imagine for me, but Ohio was pretty much 97% forested. It's really challenging to imagine as I drive around Ohio to think what it would have been like if it was just nothing but forest. But you hear these stories about how a squirrel could have, you know, gone from the Ohio River to the Lake Erie without ever touching the ground. So I don't know. There's a lot of stories about squirrels traveling long distance in trees. As I'm sure most of you are aware, you know, it is somewhat unique in the state of Ohio, not just because of the forest type or the weather patterns, the climate, but because it was settled as part of this Connecticut Western Reserve. So it was settled by you know, these New Englanders, right? It was the first survey by that Western Reserve was through Moses Cleveland of Cleveland fame. In 1796. So we're really looking, we're jumping up to basically 1800 now, right? And that first settlement was pretty slow and scattered, right? And it's been discussed as sort of, or described as a war against the woods, right? So we can see here, there's a Western Reserve. We can look over here at this map and show sort of the pattern of settlement, or at least the extension of settlement, right? The expansion of that frontier westward. And it really wasn't until 1810. So the first survey was 1800, but they're really moving to 1810 when that settlement line reaches Cleveland. I think these lines, these ISO lines are good to sort of show that rate of expansion westward. However, the point needs to be made that when we talk about western expansion, because we look at these maps, we always think of it as this like sort of contiguous, steady flow westward, that people, you know, move 5 miles at a time, or settlement goes, you know, 20 miles west and then 20 miles west the next year. Because it was sort of in the whole land was into the holdings of this Western Reserve, the way it was distributed, the way it was parsed out, because it was basically land that was speculated on, right? It wasn't like the Homestead Act of 1862, where the federal government was just granting people plots of lands to stake their claim, right? There was more speculation happening. And so as a result, a lot of these plots were kind of scattered, right? The result was that, you know, there were some people like Hudson who went out to sort of with a group of settlers to start a community, but a lot of people basically bought their plot and then they found themselves out in the middle of wood trying to clear out a homestead for themselves, right? Rather than some sort of contiguous expansion of society or development, right? And so we can really see that they had that slow start in the 1800 to 1810, right? But then really about 1820, that population really started to boom, right? And so here we can look at the total population. I don't have 1800 here, but 1800, the Western Reserve entirety was about 1,300 people. Or at 1810, it was about 1,300 people. By 1820, the population of both Geauga and Lake counties is what I'm looking at right here, both Geauga and Lake counties, because that's sort of the Chagrin River watershed for the most part, right? You know, that bumps up to about 5,000. 1850, you know, it's sort of, you see that this growth rate, annual growth rate, yeah, it's dropping because it was such a high spike between 1810 and 1825. It jumped like 250% or something crazy like that. Or not, it jumps 25% per year, which is a remarkable rate. 25% more people per year was growth in population, right? By 1850, you're still looking at about 12% growth per year. That's remarkable growth, right? But you see a steady decline. By 1900, it starts to sort of stabilize between 1850 and 1900 before you get another boost in growth with sort of the urbanization of the region between 1900 and 1950. That's a result of urbanization and industrialization. But really what I want you to see for this early part of growth of the region is that slow start between 1800 and 1820, and then this really rapid growth rate following that. Even though it looks like it's decreasing there, it's because it was the annual growth rate was so high before between, right? But of course, you know, a lot of people just scattered around in their little isolated homesteads in the woods, not a very sustainable way for a society or for a country to grow. So by 1820s, you know, you start to need infrastructure, right? And so this is just the image. 1820s, we have the establishment of the beginnings of the canal system, right? That really is what feeds into the establishment of specific cities, right? That also allows people to move their goods, right? So now it's not just a homestead where you're kind of the subsistence level, but you have the opportunity to maybe try to produce something that you can sell it somewhere, right? The canal allowed you to move something for $3 a ton to New York versus $25 a ton beforehand. So it suddenly made the idea of producing something for sale viable, right? And then by 1850s, we have the beginnings of the railroads, right? Established in Cleveland, and that really changes everything. And now, since I just spent a lot of time talking about sort of population and demographic trends and not a lot of talking about forests, let's talk about forests again, right? Up until that point, like I said, just kind of carving out a little plot in the woods. By the time the railroads come in, they have a very unique relationship with forests and development. On one sense, railroads were simply consumers of forest products. You know, by 1870, there were more than 6,000 miles of track running through Ohio, right? That took 10 million railroad ties. The preferred species was white oak or other oaks like chestnut oak. There was 10,000 miles of wood fencing associated with the tracks, 16 miles of bridges. All of that were wood material, and that was on a 5 to 7 year replacement cycle, right? So you had this early stages of settlement, and then you bring the railroads in. The railroads are serving the people of Ohio, but they are also moving through Ohio, going into the western United States where they don't have those species of tree, right? And all those pine forests of Michigan and Wisconsin that were so important, right? Those white pine forests that were so important to that timber industry, they're not useful here. But Ohio did have a lot of desirable species. So you're really sort of drawing down that it's kind of the peak of the lumber industry in Ohio is at this period serving the railroads partially. And at one point it got so bad that, you know, the residents themselves were aware of it, right? It's often for among homesteaders and people that they're sort of portrayed as this clash against subduing nature, clearing the land. But here we have a Trumbull County resident in 1884, right, saying, you know, their majestic forests are fast disappearing to aid the rapid strides of public improvements. So they feel that their environment around them is suddenly getting denuded and degraded for these notions of public improvements and infrastructure. Right? So you have by 1880s awareness of that problem. Of course, I mentioned the railroads as consumer of forest products, but the railroads are also interesting, right? Because they are the gateways, right? I meant to development, to commercial and economic transformation, right? They're catalysts here, right? So as I mentioned, the whole isolated clearings pre-1850s, the canals allowed people to move a certain amount of goods and sell it so they could at least in principle start producing things for profit, right? By the time you get in the last half of the 1800s, you're seeing this transition from sort of this mostly subsistence homesteads where they're also producing some things for sale to really getting into the point of sort of commercial agriculture, not, you know, commercial industrial agriculture we see today, but the transition from what up until that point would have sort of as New England migrants looked a lot like sort of the small New England farms in a forested landscape to fully utilizing the deeper, richer, more productive Midwest soils, right? And so they wanted to do that because they could suddenly had a more demand for their products because the Eastern United States, as well as the rest of Ohio, in the late 1800s into the 1900s was suddenly urbanizing. And now there was a demand for food to be shipped, and you had railroads that were able to ship and transport large amounts of food, large amount of grains and things, dairy even, beef even, into these population centers, right? So then it became a commercial idea, right? Not just a good way to make some cash, but the farm was sort of a commodity producing machine, right? And to do that, that incentivized the idea that now there was an incentive to clear more land. And this worked out really well because not only was the railroad providing the means to get these commodities cheaply to market to generate revenue, to generate income, but the hard work of clearing land was incentivized because the railroad was a market for the lumber itself, right? So you had this really sort of rush to clear land for agriculture, as well as provide that lumber for the railroad company. And just as to prove this point, that Ohio was a great example, or sort of the classic quintessential example of this. I don't know if you can see this, but I have this fat book called Americans and Their Forests. It's a geography of forests in America. It's 1992, so it's a little dated. But for his case study, this covers the entire United States, and so it spends a lot of time in sort of the forests of New England and Michigan and Pacific Northwest as far as forest products goes. But the case study on clearing of agricultural land in the United States and clearing of forests was the state of Ohio, right? The result was there were some forests, but the remaining forests in the Northeast were going to be small, fragmented woodlots, right? This was sort of the back 40, so to speak, and inaccessible ravines, right? So think about a lot of those old hemlock forests that we think, those are some of the relics of this forest clear, agricultural clearing. And this is what it would have looked like. This is a cutout. This is actually a county in Wisconsin, so the dates are a little off. We would have you probably want to move this back about, I don't know, 20 years or so. But this hatch line is going to be forested lands, and so initial settlement, you're dealing with a landscape that's, in case of Ohio, 95% forest or whatever, and not too long, 50 years or so, you're looking at this patchwork where you have some larger chunks of forested land, but a lot of agricultural land cut out of it. Fast forward another 20 years or so, and you have even fewer little relics of forest plots. And then by the time you get to the 1950s or 1900s in the case of Ohio, you have sort of the peak deforestation and land clearing. And that's flushed out in the case of Ohio. This is Ohio as a whole, not specific to Northeast Ohio. But you see the yellow or blue line here, or sorry, the orange line is the percent of land cleared, while the blue is the million acres of total land cleared in the state of Ohio, right? And so you hear a very pretty linear straight line, incline going up into 1880. And then after 1880, which times well with that sentiment of that resident in Trumbull County, sort of having this realization of the dramatic exploitation of the forest resource and the devastation of the forest resource, this sort of awareness that it's almost all gone, and sort of starts to taper out. And then early 1900s, 1900 and 1910 is when we started to see sort of the plateau, right? Depending on your number, this is sort of cleared land that I got from that book I just showed you, right? So that's percentage of land in the state of Ohio cleared. I've run into other places where it says, rather than, in this case, closer to 20% of the land was left forested, it was actually closer to 10%. My understanding is those counts sort of include the urban areas, versus this is talking about agricultural clearing of forests, right? So either way, that was a low point for Ohio forests between basically 1800 and 1900 to go from 95% forested to 10% forested. It's pretty dramatic. But we know that we actually, good news is forests have been on the rebound since then, right? There was a plateau. It would be nice. I could talk about how that is sort of the result of their sort of environmental consciousness awakening, but a lot of it's really economic and demographic, right? I mean, the fact of the matter is that we had urbanization, people moving from farms, especially small farms, into the city to work in industries, right? A lot of that large-scale industrial agriculture, just like it moved from those small farms to the Midwest in Ohio, leaving New England to be the first region to industrialize and then enter into a post-industrial landscape that we see today. Ohio, a lot of that small agriculture production or smaller agricultural production went farther west into places like Iowa, right, and Kansas and Nebraska, where it was even larger tracts of land and more industrial and more commercial. What we see there today, and so really post sort of mid 1900s or 1920s onward, we see a sort of the decline of not agricultural production necessarily in volume, but lands devoted and cleared specifically for agriculture. And the result is we are blessed in the eastern United States that when our forest lands are cleared, we have an environment, right, that physical environment that when left to themselves, they become forests again. There are places in the world where they're not so lucky. And so when they make mistakes such as we did, they don't get to bounce back so well, right? That's also been associated with ex-urban development. So this is another land use that is defined as urban sprawl or suburban sprawl. But it often ends up with relatively largish, multi-acre tracts of land for individual landowners that are left to regenerate into forest or maintained as forest for their aesthetic and other values, right? So today we're looking at about, in the state, 30% forest cover, which a lot of that increase has been in the northeastern United States or northeastern Ohio, particularly since those 1950s. And that 30% forest cover is pretty much what we're dealing with in the Northeast as a whole as well. And it's almost spot on with Lake and Geauga County. And so this is just an example of that process, right? We can see 1952, so this is Chagrin Falls here in the bottom left-hand corner. And we see all this sort of mosaic. It's harder to see because it's black and white, but the mosaic of lots of fields. You have the river there, and so that's forested. And you have some of these ridges and upland lands that are forested, but a lot of that is cleared agricultural, right? You also see the road network and infrastructure network is dominated by that sort of township and range relic of grid layout, right? Now we can look at today, 2020, here's Chagrin Falls, the river running through it, that same landscape. Well, it's actually much more forested, but we also see, ironically, it's actually more densely populated, right? So I'm sure if we really look, all those grid roads are still there, but we also see a lot of these sort of winding, circuitous, meandering subdivisions, right? So you have these houses and these marginally wooded lots, okay? So that is increasing our forest cover, at least what shows up from the aerial view, right? And you can see here, yes, this is the sign of the increasing forest cover in the Northeast, right? A lot of that, if you look back in 1950, would have looked a lot more like this region right here, or other parts of the western parts of the state. But if you look closely, well, that's a good story. We also need to recognize that that landscape, that forest is highly fragmented, right? We can contrast this forest cover here with the forest cover here in some state lands in Southeast Ohio or Southern Ohio, right? So are we out of the woods, so to speak? Well, not really. Northeast Ohio, as well as most of Ohio, we're still dealing with a really highly fragmented landscape. I also mentioned that we've sort of plateaued at our forest cover at 30% for the past 50 years or so, with a sign that there's a potential of a decline there, right? I mentioned that sort of ex-urban development as landscape that sort of maintains some forest cover, right? Or larger small patches of fragmented forest, but still forest cover. Well, as the suburban pressure expands in places like Geauga and Lake County from sprawling metropolitan areas like Cleveland and Akron, that's going to sort of eat into that reforestation, right? We see here in the case of Cleveland, this is characteristic of Midwestern cities. I always associate sprawl with the West, but the reality is that some of the worst sprawling cities are the Midwest, because even the population doesn't grow. From 1950 to 2000, we're still looking at essentially the same population. We see a dramatic increase in the area of the physical development in that metropolitan area. So looking forward, right? Despite those sort of challenges, I also wanted to go mention that, well, we might not be sort of losing dramatically forest cover, right, we have other threats that compromise the composition and health of our forest, right? So we can't just look at, well, how many acres of forest cover or canopy cover, how many trees per acre do we have? We want to see, how are those trees healthy? How are invasive species threatening the future dynamics in those ecosystems, right? What type of species are regenerating, as I've mentioned with you? Are there unsustainable harvests that are shifting the species composition, making one species more dominant than the other? And how is that going to interact with the changing climate? But I'm still optimistic looking forward. You know, we are more enlightened of all the benefits and services that forest ecosystems provide. People value forests not just for their timber production, not just for the land that can be converted into agriculture, but for the aesthetic value, the sort of self-edifying characteristics of it, as well as sort of carbon sequestration and fresh air, right? We also have more scientific ecological knowledge to address these problems moving forward. And a lot of public, private, and nonprofit institutions like the state of Ohio, Holden Arboretum, Western Reserve Land Conservancy, that are conscious in leveraging that knowledge to address the problems the best they can. And I always want to say that, you know, forests are resilient and dynamic. And so I can talk about how, well, maybe the forests are changing in a way that we don't recognize or aren't satisfied with, but in the end, maybe it's us that sort of have to learn how to deal with these new forests and changing forests, right? So thank you. I think I went a long time there, but I'm happy for any questions.
All righty. Thank you, Adam. That was great. It made me start thinking.
Okay, that's good. Let's start.
So I'm going to check the question box area. Let's see. Sometimes people like to wait until the end to put any questions. I don't see any currently, but I know before we went live, we kind of were talking about how because forests have been torn, you know, removed and then farmed and then forests regenerate, they're not coming back the same as they once were as communities. Now I know Dan raised his hand, but the way with GoToWebinars, you kind of have to put the question in the question box. Dan, if that helps. Especially for me, I mean, I did go to Southern Ohio this weekend, so I did see some different forest types, and it's a little bit more biodiversity down there, but it definitely, you could tell where areas where it was farmed or disturbed in some ways compared to areas where it wasn't. The amount of biodiversity was insane, where like there was the old growth stuff and it was just amazing. And insane.
I mean, Appalachia in general is, you know, the most diverse region. Not specifically Ohio, although you get into that part of Southern Ohio where you were, and you have going back to sort of the something that I as a forester often overlook, focusing on sort of the, you know, sunlight and issues. The influence of the sort of the more calcium heavy lime based soils from influencing up from Kentucky, because Kentucky has its own weird collection of tree species adapted to those soils. But you also get a really strong microclimates because of the changes in topography, because of those steep slopes, where you get on the southwest slopes, you get trees that are going to be drier because they get more you know, sunlight. Higher up on the slope, it's always going to be drier and more well drained, and so you have dominated those oak dominated landscapes. And then you'll go on the northeast side of that slope, and it's going to look a lot more like what you probably saw, especially in the old growth forests that you're familiar with in northeast Ohio. So large yellow poplar, but also big maple and basswood, things like that.
Yeah. Like there was a
You
ton
get a
of
little bit of it.
buckeyes.
Oh, well, that's because you're
There's like
also,
no buckeyes up here. So it's
that's
exciting.
true. Yeah, that's a classic. Growing up in Northeast Ohio, I knew we were the Buckeye State, and I'd seen a couple Buckeyes. You know, they always playing them outside old elementary school, and it wasn't until I was really in Southern Ohio where I appreciated why everyone associated Ohio with Buckeyes.
All right, so I got Dan's question or statement. Hold on. So maple sugaring is, especially up here, it's very popular, and a lot of people do maintain maples over a lot of other woods because of the maple sugaring in lots. It also, sugar maples are very good at, they're like a um, harder maple compared to like your red maple and your silver maple. So I know there are certain areas in Geauga County where logging was a little bit more difficult. So there are some random trees that you'll find that are big that were left because logging. So it's more of a statement than a question.
Hmm.
And also there was a coal production that kept areas deforested, especially in Clarendon Township, which I did not know that there was a coal production in this region. That's an interesting fact that I didn't know, and my family's lived in Geauga County for a long time and has been up in Northeast
Yeah,
Ohio for a very long time, so that's really cool.
that's yeah, that's I mean those are some really good points. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned those because I didn't have time or include anything about maple sugaring, and I knew that is a big, that is a classic example of how even good forest management starts to shape the landscape, right? Because the preferential saving of maple trees create more, higher percentage, more kind of dominated or almost exclusively maple stands, as well as I mentioned those a lot of those woods that were remained that weren't necessarily inaccessible also would have just been left as woodlots. And so this is as a forester, um, I hate the term old growth. It's fine. I don't want to not. It's okay to use it, but because it's not a very specific terminology, right? I mean, it means it's old trees. Well, there are lots of old trees, and so a lot of times you get in these situations where you have these plots that might have a few really old trees, but they're still these sort of lived-in, managed sort of social forests in the sense that they are a product of the human landscape as much as they are the natural landscape. Um, and that doesn't make them any less or valuable or less sort of natural. It just, but those trees also become the seed trees or the potential seed trees. And so all those sort of dynamics um, come into play when you start thinking about, all right, what is that forest left? And that goes to what you were talking about with, well, how do forests get old fields get reforested? Well, they have to get that seed source for something. So that is what gets left in the landscape, and those small woodlots end up having a differential effect on what sort of repopulates some of those old fields.
Yeah, that is for sure. Oh, all right, so another comment from Dan. Sugar bushes, however, are more groves of maples, not diverse and multi-layered forests per old photographs of sugaring or maple sugaring in early 1900s. Also, yeah, things have definitely changed. It should also be interesting to see how our forests are changing with all the different tree diseases that are going around. Like up here in Lake County, we had the beech leaf disease was
Yeah.
discovered, and pretty much all of our beech now have it, sadly to say.
Mm-hmm.
All our ash have pretty much died.
Yeah.
Uh, and then my first speaker for the series was Tom Macy from ODNR, and so he talked about different other pests too. So he talked a little bit about oak wilt and then hemlock woolly adelgid, and then another talk that I heard him speak, he said that in Kentucky they're having what they call laurel wilt. which
Mhm.
would affect sassafras and spice bush.
Yeah,
So another thing to keep out. So it's sad
yeah,
a little
and
bit.
yeah, it's a real challenge. I mean, you mentioned the ash already. We all know about sort of duck elm disease. That's a,
No,
old one,
and
right?
chestnut.
Um, yes, but between the elm, there's a whole. What doesn't show up on those forest types is that, especially more in western um, Ohio, before all that land was drained for agriculture, is a lot of these wetlands and riparian areas are sort of flat riparian areas, not the steep rocky ones that become hemlock, but those were dominated by a forest type called the ash elm forest type. Um, and so in some of the most sensitive, ecologically sensitive areas, wetlands and riparian areas, we've lost the two dominant species in there. And there aren't a lot of great sort of large saw timber sized tree species left to fill that intermittently inundated um, ecotone there, right? Um,
Mhm.
and then beech. When I worked up in the New York, they have beech bark disease, right? Which had not reached Ohio, so that was kind of a nice thing to see when I got here. But it's sad to see the beech leaf disease, um, and I don't know if there's been any studies about that. But I have concerns because the beech. I noticed that when they get stressed with the beech leaf disease, they all shoot up their suckers, right?
Mhm.
Um, and that's doubly problematic because then that casts a really low shade. So not only is the dominant tree in that stand sick and dying, but it is now interfering with the regeneration of any other species because it's dominating that understory sapling layer with sort of doomed stems. So that sort of interrupts the entire sort of restoration or recovery process for the forest. So it start to sort of, as we deal with issues of sort of climate change now, it's these double whammy of changing environment and pests undermine the resilience that has been a characteristic of our diverse eastern hardwood forests, that they have so many different species to fill those gaps when something happens. But there are fewer and fewer of those species to do that.
Yeah, it's definitely not. It seems very bleak. It's hard to be positive, but we have to be positive. Hopefully, all we could do is get people on board. But I know with the beech leaf disease, they have limited it to like a nematode at Holden. Pretty much that is the guilty party. Now it's to try to
Okay.
figure out, are birds carrying the nematode to beech leaf to beech, tree, or is it traveling through water? And there's all that. So I know Holden's doing research on that. So I don't, that's as far as I think they've gotten though with it. So,
All right.
but
Yeah.
we're already almost 10, 10 after 8. I think
I'm
we can
sorry.
call. No, you're fine. Partially it's my fault because I'm asking questions.
No, that's good.
um, but I think we can call it a night. If anyone else has any questions that comes to mind, you can always send me an email and I can ask Adam if I cannot answer it. So everyone have a good night and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks, Adam. Bye.
Thank you, Heather. Thanks everyone for being here.